In Tantra, one truth is repeatedly emphasized by the scriptures and by the living lineages. It is not the outer act that transforms, but the inner state with which it is performed. This inner state is called bhava. Bhava is often translated as feeling, attitude, or inner disposition, but in practice it is much more than emotion. Bhava is the inner alignment of the practitioner, where mind, heart, body, and intention move together in one direction. It is the difference between merely doing a practice and entering the practice. So why does Tantra places such importance on Bhava? Tantra does not see reality as distant or abstract. It sees consciousness as immediately present, responsive, and relational. Therefore, practice is not about convincing a deity to appear. It is about becoming inwardly capable of perceiving what is already there. Bhava is what makes this possible. The Kulanava Tantra states clearly, Bhavahinam japam tyakta bhava yuktam tapuja. It says, if you don't have bhava, your japa is a waste of time. And on the other hand, even simple worship performed with bhava bears fruit. Anyone who has practiced mantra japa for some time will recognize this truth. You may chant thousands of mantras, but if the mind is restless, closed, or emotionally disconnected, the practice feels dry. And on the other hand, even a few repetitions done with presence and sincerity feel alive and nourishing. So that is the significance of bhava in mantra sadhana. In mantra sadhana, bhava is what turns sound into Shakti. Mantra is described in Tantra as Chaitanya Rupa, which translates to consciousness itself taking the form of the sound. But consciousness responds to consciousness only. The mantra Mahodadhi explains that mantra awakens through bhavana, deep contemplative feeling and inner participation. Without this, mantra remains at the level of the tongue and mind. With bhava, it begins to descend into the body, breath, and subtle layers of awareness. A simple example can be the difference between repeating a mantra mechanically while thinking of other things compared to repeating it while feeling the presence of the Devata, sensing the mantra vibrating in the heart or navel. The mantra itself is the same, but the experience is completely different. Bhava is what bridges that gap. In Devata Upasana, Bhava is even more essential. Tantra does not treat the Devata as a distant god who grants favors when pleased. The Devata is a living expression of consciousness, a specific doorway into the divine. The Tantraloka of Abhinavagupta explains that realization occurs when the practitioner's inner state becomes non-different from the Devata's nature. This does not happen through imagination alone. It happens when Bhava matures. For a Vairava Upasaka, this might mean cultivating fearlessness, spaciousness, and acceptance of impermanence. For a devotee of Kali, it may involve surrender to change, death of ego, and radical honesty. The Devata responds not to offerings alone, but to the congruence of your inner states. Many practitioners notice this intuitively. On days when the heart is open and grounded, the deity feels near, while on days of tension or doubt, the connection feels distant. This is not the Devata withdrawing, it is the Bhava within you shifting. And it is important to understand that Bhava is cultivated, not forced. Bhava is not emotional excitement or dramatic intensity. Tantra does not ask for manufactured feelings. Bhava grows naturally through steady practice, ethical living, humility, and patience. The Shiva Sutra reminds us that awareness deepens through abhyasa, gentle, consistent returning to the same practice. Even when Bhava feels absent, practice still prepares the ground. Over time, the practitioner learns to recognize subtle signs, warmth, stillness, intimacy, or a sense of being inwardly met. That is the real fruit of Bhava. When Bhava matures, practice stops feeling like effort, japa becomes absorption, worship becomes relationship, and the boundary between the sadhaka, the mantra, and the devata dissolves. This is why Tantra teaches that Bhava is not decoration, it is the doorway. Without it, practice remains external. With it, even the simplest sadhana becomes transformative. And perhaps most importantly, Bhava keeps the path human. It allows sincerity, vulnerability, and lived experience to guide practice rather than ego, ambition, or more technique. That is why the wise say, Protect your bhava more carefully than your rituals because rituals work only when your bhava is alive.